Let's go Ravens! What if some of the biggest stories coming out of the Ravens offseason aren't actually about the biggest stars on the roster? Everyone expects Lamar Jackson to look like Lamar Jackson. Everyone expects Derrick Henry to be Derrick Henry. That's not what's turning heads right now. Instead, the conversations inside the organization are beginning to shift toward a completely different group of players. Guys who may not be household names today but could end up playing much bigger roles than anyone expected once the season begins. Even more interesting, one respected voice who has spent time around the team has identified several names that continue to stand out, along with some surprising observations about established veterans that every Ravens fan should hear. Some players are quietly building momentum. Others still have important questions surrounding them. And together, these updates paint a fascinating picture of where this football team may be heading as preparations continue. But before we get into all of it, make sure you've already hit that like button if you believe the Ravens have what it takes to surprise a lot of people this season. And I want to see the optimism from Ravens Nation in the comments. Type, "Go Ravens! Our future is brighter than ever." Now let's get straight into the latest developments. One of the biggest takeaways from the recent discussion is that the Ravens' biggest stars continue to look exactly like the players fans have come to expect. According to the observations shared, Lamar Jackson looks sharp, remains in excellent shape, and continues to display the same quickness and comfort that have defined his game for years. There wasn't a sense that he needed to prove anything during off-season practices because, quite simply, he's already established exactly who he is. The same applies to Derrick Henry. Rather than searching for dramatic changes, the feeling is that Henry remains one of those rare players who doesn't create concern during off-season workouts. Instead of looking for spectacular highlights, the focus would only shift if something appeared unusual. Otherwise, he's simply expected to continue being the same dependable player everyone already knows. Zay Flowers also received encouraging observations. While there may not be drastic differences compared to previous seasons, he was described as looking even sharper, more polished, and somehow even quicker during off-season work. It wasn't necessarily about showing new abilities, but rather about looking more experienced and refined in everything he was doing on the field. However, once the conversation moved beyond those proven stars, several fascinating questions started to emerge. The discussion pointed out that outside of Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, and Zay Flowers, there are still plenty of unknowns on the offensive side of the football. That uncertainty creates opportunities for younger players to establish themselves, and several names are beginning to attract attention as possible breakout candidates. Adam Randall was one of the first players mentioned as someone worth watching closely. The expectation isn't necessarily that he'll become a major contributor immediately, but there is genuine intrigue surrounding his combination of size and physical tools. The belief is that his role could gradually expand as the season progresses, making him one of the more interesting developmental players currently on the roster. Jacoby Lane also continues generating excitement because of his size and catch radius. While Elijah Sarrett was praised for possessing the skill set to potentially contribute sooner, the current impression is that Lane has been receiving more opportunities during off-season work. Considering he was selected earlier, that development isn't viewed as surprising, but it certainly makes him one of the most intriguing young players to monitor moving forward. Another name that deserves attention is Leonte Wester. One of the more interesting observations from the discussion is that Wester has consistently taken advantage of the opportunities he's been given during camp. With uncertainty still existing behind Zay Flowers on the depth chart, players like Wester have a real chance to carve out meaningful roles if they continue performing well. His value as a returner was also highlighted, making his path to being active on game days even more realistic if the current situation remains unchanged. Dayton Wade was another player mentioned in a positive light. He has reportedly made the most of his opportunities during practices as well. However, unlike Wester, there are still questions about how often he would actually be active on game days because he doesn't currently bring the same special teams role. That doesn't diminish what he's shown during camp, but it does make his path to consistent playing time more challenging. On the defensive side of the ball, there were several young players who managed to stand out despite not receiving much national attention. Zion Young continues to be viewed as an intriguing rookie with plenty of potential. Tavius Robinson also earned praise as a dependable player who consistently sets the edge and continues doing the little things that coaches appreciate. Neither player is generating massive headlines, but both were identified as individuals worth keeping an eye on as the season approaches. The secondary also produced several encouraging observations. Marist Robinson reportedly made multiple plays throughout OTA practices and minicamp, while Keandre Jackson and Robert Longerbeam also caught attention with their performances. At the same time, there was an honest acknowledgement that earning consistent regular season roles will be difficult because of the competition throughout the defensive backfield. Still, making positive impressions this early in the offseason is exactly what these young players needed to do. Perhaps the most fascinating defensive discussion centered around T.J. Tampa. The belief expressed was that Tampa could legitimately earn an important role once the regular season begins, provided he stays healthy. Rather than being viewed as someone who may move around the secondary, the impression is that he's primarily a boundary corner, and if circumstances create opportunities, the coaching staff appears willing to find ways to get him onto the field. Health remains the biggest question, but the confidence in his ability was clear. One of the more unexpected storylines involved a position that rarely receives much attention during the offseason: punter. Ryan Eckley was singled out as someone who repeatedly impressed observers during practices. His ability to generate tremendous hang time, produce different types of punts, and consistently drive the football stood out enough to become one of the surprise stories of camp. It's not often that a specialist becomes one of the most talked about performers during off-season workouts, but that's exactly what has happened so far. Stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, the overall message is one of cautious optimism. The established stars continue to perform like established stars. Several young players are beginning to separate themselves from the pack. At the same time, there are still legitimate questions surrounding offensive depth and exactly how some of these position battles will unfold once training camp begins. Nothing has been decided yet, but there are certainly players creating reasons for fans to pay close attention over the coming weeks. What makes this particularly exciting is that many of the names generating positive buzz aren't necessarily the obvious ones. While everyone naturally watches Lamar Jackson, Derrick Henry, and Zay Flowers, some of the most intriguing developments may ultimately come from players who entered the offseason without nearly as much attention. If even a few of these emerging contributors continue developing at their current pace, they could become important pieces of the Ravens' success later in the season. There was also an interesting discussion about the overall outlook for this Ravens team, and one point stood out immediately. Despite all the changes that have taken place, the expectations remain high. However, those expectations are also being viewed through a realistic lens. This isn't simply about making bold predictions. It's about recognizing both the strengths of this roster and the challenges that still need to be addressed before the regular season begins. The belief shared during the conversation is that this team has enough talent to return to the playoffs. In fact, the expectation is that Baltimore should once again be competing near the top of the AFC North. At the same time, there was an acknowledgement that this season brings a very different dynamic compared to previous years. There's a rookie head coach, a rookie offensive coordinator, and plenty of young coaches stepping into larger responsibilities. That alone creates an entirely new environment around the organization. Because of those changes, there is also recognition that patience may be required in certain areas. While the foundation of the roster includes proven stars, there are still questions surrounding the depth at several offensive positions. Much of the optimism surrounding the younger players comes from potential rather than established production. That's why training camp and the preseason will be so important. Those practices and games will help determine which players are ready to take advantage of the opportunities that currently exist. Another point that shouldn't be overlooked is how consistently the discussion returned to the importance of competition. Nothing appears guaranteed for many of these younger players. Whether it's at wide receiver, in the secondary, or on special teams, the message is clear. The coaching staff wants players to earn their roles. Every practice, every repetition, and every opportunity matters. That competitive atmosphere could ultimately bring out the best in several members of this roster. What's especially encouraging is that many of the names receiving positive attention aren't just making one impressive play here or there. Instead, they're being recognized for consistently taking advantage of their opportunities. That's often the first sign that a player is beginning to build trust with the coaching staff. Consistency is what separates off-season excitement from legitimate regular season opportunities, and several young Ravens appear to be moving in that direction. At the same time, the conversation remained balanced. There was no attempt to declare that these players have already earned starting jobs or guaranteed roster spots. Instead, the emphasis was placed on